Seems like almost every day we hear something new about artificial intelligence. Is it going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the latest article I saw shows that at least in one way, it might be useful for those of us who have multiple sclerosis. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with MS for over 40 years, and yes, you're actually seeing me today. This may not happen every week, I don't know, but I'm in a different location and I'm using a different computer. Still, it's a step in the right direction, right? Anything that looks like progress, we're going to take it to be progress. Well, I've seen some articles about artificial intelligence and all the different things that it does for the medical world. And I've seen some scare stories about it's going to replace various jobs, even jobs that you would have thought were fairly highly skilled. Well, I don't even know that we know what the truth is going to be until everything shakes out, and it may never. But I want to share an article with you that I saw that I think is pretty interesting because it's looking at kind of a higher level of how you classify multiple sclerosis and the various stages of the progression of the disease. And I always find that interesting. So let's take a look. This article was in Multiple Sclerosis News Today on August 27th of 2025. It's called New AI or Artificial Intelligence Model Challenges How Multiple Sclerosis is Classified. So this is pretty fundamental, I would say. Viewing MS as a single disease, not by type, might improve management. A new model using artificial intelligence or AI suggests that multiple sclerosis progression is better viewed along a single disease spectrum rather than as distinct disease types, such as those now used in MS diagnosis and treatment, according to a study led by scientists in Europe. The global research team says moving to this view could ultimately lead to better disease management for people with MS. Our data clearly show that MS cannot be characterized by subtypes such as relapsing or progressive MS, but instead a continuous disease process with definable state transitions. Heinz Wiendl, MD, a professor at the University of Freiburg and one of the study's senior authors, said in a university news story outlining the study's findings. Instead of categorizing MS patients, we should quantify their state and track it dynamically, said Wiendl, a neurologist. The study, AI-driven reclassification of multiple sclerosis progression, was published in the journal Nature Medicine. In MS, the immune system mistakenly attacks healthy parts of the brain and spinal cord. The neurodegenerative disease is categorized into three main types based on its clinical presentation, meaning the symptoms seen among patients. Relapsing remitting MS, or RRMS, is characterized by relapses or periods in which symptoms worsen, interspersed with periods of remission where symptoms ease or go away entirely. It is thought to be largely driven by inflammatory activity. Progressive MS, on the other hand, is marked by symptoms that steadily worsen over time, with neurodegeneration that happens even without relapses or signs of active inflammation. In primary progressive MS, or PPMS, this progression starts right from disease onset, whereas secondary progressive MS, or SPMS, follows RRMS. Disease type now determines treatment strategies for patients. These classifications are used to determine treatment strategies and predict prognosis. However, evidence suggests that the distinctions may not be so clear-cut, and that they may have limited value for predicting the disease course and treatment responses. This raises the important question of whether the current MS categorization into distinct subtypes is justified or whether MS would be better described as a disease continuum, from a focal and inflammatory to a progressive disease course, the researchers wrote. With this in mind, the scientists used an AI-based approach to develop a new MS classification system that would be independent of the diagnosed disease type. They built the AI model using data from more than 8,000 people with RRMS, SPMS, or PPMS, who were included in a large Novartis-sponsored clinical trial database. The data came from 9 phase 2/3 clinical trials and covered up to 15 years of follow-up, with approximately 120,000 neurological assessments and more than 35,000 MRI scans. So in other words, lots of data. But that's what AI is good at, is assessing lots of data. The researchers identified 4 aspects of MS that best capture its progression: physical disability, brain damage, clinical relapses, and silent inflammatory activity seen on MRI scans. These variables were used to build a model that gives a probabilistic assessment of how likely people with MS are to transition between 8 distinct disease states over time. So instead of 3, we now are looking at 8, apparently, but I'm curious to see what they define as the transitions. Let's hope they discuss that. This included states 1 through 3, which are early phases of clinical stability with minimal disability, and stage 4, or asymptomatic MRI disease activity. State 5 corresponds to a clinical relapse, and states 6 through 8 are phases of advanced MS in which there's less inflammation but a greater neurodegeneration and disability. States 4 and 5 were both considered intermediate inflammatory stages. According to this framework, patients don't have to move linearly through these states. Instead, they can transition in any order or direction. Still, the data indicated that it's nearly impossible for a person to progress directly to advanced stages without first experiencing some type of intermediate inflammatory activity. Further, once patients are in advanced stages, they won't return to an early clinically stable phase, the data indicated. As most people diagnosed with either SPMS or PPMS were considered to be in advanced stages, the data don't support distinguishing between the two entities, according to the researchers. They linked to an article that they published in April 9th of 2025 called AI Tool Effectively Measures MS Disease Activity from One MRI Scan. I remember hearing something about that. It looks pretty promising. Again, it's the power of AI to analyze lots of data and perhaps see connections that we humans may miss. So I'd highly recommend you take a look at that article too. And now the AI-based model must be tested in clinical practice. The AI approach was then validated using data from a separate clinical trial and real-world databases. Overall, the model was accurate in predicting a person's risk of transitioning to advanced MS, according to the researchers. Data also showed that treatment with an MS disease-modifying therapy increases the odds that a person will stay in early, mild disease stages for longer. The findings support a new way of describing MS, the team noted. Our model results are more compatible with the view of MS as a disease continuum than with the traditional view of distinct types, the researchers wrote. Ultimately, scientists hope this new framework will help patients access treatment more easily. The currently used classification system limits which patients can access DMTs, as most are indicated for relapsing disease types. And I would make a note, too, that this affects us in terms of what our insurance will cover, because using these classification systems, A lot of us, when we were diagnosed as relapsing, had access to certain drugs that once we were told we were in secondary progressive, the insurance companies would no longer cover them because they said there's no clinical evidence that they are effective. If the new system were to be adopted, it would allow for treatment to be initiated based on individual risk assessment, regardless of the diagnosed disease type. Patients with active but clinically silent inflammatory activity in particular require early treatment decisions, as the model strikingly demonstrates, the news story noted. Now the model needs to be tested in clinical practice to see how useful it is for making MS treatment decisions in real-world settings, according to the team. In conclusion, they say that the AI model could have implications beyond MS. Lutz Hein, MD, who is not one of the study's authors but serves as Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Freiburg, noted that the idea behind this AI model to move past rigid disease categorizations also has implications beyond MS. The principle is fundamental and pioneering, and it can also be applied to many other diseases, both within neurology and beyond, Hein said. Well, having looked at that, I think we want to hear from a couple of folks who have some different opinions on artificial intelligence in this particular context and also just in general. I think that it's very worth hearing.
Well, I think it's important to start by saying there's not any tools out there at the moment that are able to do that. But AI is really unique because it has this ability to take in a lot of data and learn from a lot of data in a way that a human couldn't necessarily do it. And there are obviously statistical methods out there that exist to handle this sort of thing, but they have very rigid structures, whereas AI is a lot more flexible, so it can learn in a more flexible way. So I think AI is definitely capable of learning about what your risk of relapse might be, what your risk of progression might be. And then I think, as a person with MS, that can be helpful in picking what treatment you might want to go on, especially if you're thinking about maybe like family planning and things, to know your risk of relapse and progression on those treatments.
I think that's a really good question, and I think I would kind of answer that. It depends on what AI strategy you're talking about. I think there are some tools which some people may be using already. So, for example, there are AI tools that can use, take MRI data and identify new lesions in an automated fashion. And I think some services are using those, and that's going to become more and more frequently used over the next few years. So that's probably the most mature clinical tool that we're using in AI and clinical services in MS. I think there are other things which people might not think about they're actually using AI for. So, for example, in my service, if I'm creating a patient information leaflet, I might use some quite high-level information, but then put that through a large language model like ChatGPT, just as an example, and that can produce very quickly and with very little effort a patient information leaflet directed at a kind of universal reading age, because I think a big thing that I am aware of is health literacy, and that health literacy levels in some areas of the UK are potentially quite low, and so I think we need to be able to provide information for everybody that everybody can understand. So I think that's one area where AI can be used really easily and quickly, and there are other tools that you can use to, maybe it doesn't produce information but allows you to assess the information that you produced. I think another area which we'll probably talk about in a bit more detail is we're providing a lot of data. We need a lot of data to make decisions for patient care, but that data we need to be able to assimilate that data and make it usable. And there are various tools that are about to come into proper clinical use that enable us to extract the data from clinical records and make that easily accessible for clinicians, and then that improves the kind of communication with the patients themselves. think there are going to be lots of benefits in the long run. And I think we've talked about the use of being able to predict patient outcomes. And that's obviously going to be a massive benefit from choosing treatments and communicating with patients as well about risk and benefit. And there are other benefits in terms of improved communication, probably administrative tasks that will be better or more efficiently done with the use of AI tools. And I think there's a perception that it's going to replace clinicians and replace admin. It's not going to do that. It's going to augment our care and make it more efficient and allow us to concentrate on the stuff that we really want to do, like talking to people and offering help. You know, an awful lot of the work I do in clinic is administrative, and I'd like to see tools that will, you know, help me with that bit and allow me to spend more time with patients.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there's like the healthcare professional side of things and allowing them to have more time with patients, freeing up their workload, as well as like radiologists helping them to identify lesions on an MRI scan, and maybe even identify them more accurately, because you know all they have to do is say yes or no, that is a lesion. And then I think from the patient side, having more access to clinicians because their time isn't so administrative will be really beneficial. And I think it's really just adding more tools. Like when you're looking at predicting how well you'll do on a treatment, that's just a tool that a clinician now has to use with someone who's experiencing MS. And, then the radiologists have this tool that can help them with their work. So it's just adding in tools. We're not taking anything away.
I think concerns about AI are well-founded. I think there are concerns. I think we need to be very clear that the data and the information that we get out is only as good as how we train the models, and that we have to be as careful as we can not to introduce bias, because if all the information is provided about a certain or from a certain population, then you'll only get predictions about that population. So we need to be careful about that as people developing the tools. And there are concerns about privacy and consent. And I think as a community, we need to be very aware of that and be very open about it and be very careful where we're putting people's data and information. And then that, we also need to be aware as people using AI that it does make things up occasionally. We've all heard about cases of, it can create references, it has hallucinations. So again, I think we need to be very, use these tools judiciously and they're not going to replace humans. They're going to be an adjunct, another tool, which will help us improve accuracy on some things. But, just like we will have fears about completely automated cars, I think they're well-founded. But that shouldn't put us off, using the benefits in a responsible way, like with any new kind of innovation, really.
Yeah, also completely agree with that as well. I think, there's so I guess to be aware of in terms of like regulatory approval in the UK. So like if it's going to be a decision maker, so something that would say you have to take this treatment, then that would need a clinical trial. And I don't think there's much in MS that is going to be like that at all. Whereas things that are just tools that are supporting, they don't necessarily need a clinical trial, but they do need a lot of supporting evidence. They need regulatory approval from like NICE and like EMA. So there are barriers in place to make sure that tools that aren't beneficial aren't getting into the clinic. And privacy is always going to be a massive concern. I think, everyone being aware of what their data is being used for, that sort of transparency is going to be really important. And I think in terms of hallucinations and AI making things up, sort of having explainable AI is probably going to be really important to that. So if you understand how your model is making a prediction, then you can sort of keep it in check and make sure that it's only using factors that you would like to be included, and it's not using like if someone has a pet as a predictor for relapse. So I think there are barriers in place, but we've got to be open and honest about them.
Okay, well, the more I think about artificial intelligence, it reminds me of a chainsaw. And I don't know if you have one of those. I would not want one in my house. But I know that they are actually very useful tools for a particular task as long as you keep control of them and they don't malfunction. And those are two pretty big ifs, because if either of those things goes wrong, disaster may ensue, and sometimes disaster that can't be easily recovered from. And that's really what we're dealing with artificial intelligence. I think we need to be cautious wading in too quickly in certain areas, because once the genie is out of the bottle, you're not going to get it back in, right? So let's be careful and cautious, but let's not stick our heads in the sand. We want to keep an eye on what the medical community is looking at with artificial intelligence and how they might want to use it, because it's going to affect us, and maybe we don't want that. Maybe the time to raise our voices is now before it's too late. May not do any good, but at least we know we tried. But that's all I have for you today. So until I see you again in my next video, please do take really good care of yourself. I'll see you again soon.